Welcome to the What Really Happened radio show. Because World War III, really bad idea. Here is your host, Michael Rivero.
And aloha, America. Welcome to our show. It's Tuesday, April 2nd, 2013, getting into the week, getting into the brand new month. Still a lot of heavy weather over there in Europe. Northern Hemisphere still in the grip of winter, actually. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. Keep an eye on the situation over there in Cyprus, because the total losses to the people of Cyprus are still kind of fluctuating. Some people are saying, oh, don't worry, it's only going to be 40%. Others are saying 60. Others are saying could go to 80. Remember, CNN was reporting yesterday there is a second haircut coming, which proves the first one didn't really fix anything. And I think Cyprus has actually destroyed itself. Because if you think about the way an economy is supposed to work, the bankers are thinking solely in terms of we need to get some cash back so we can loan it back to the people at interest. And they don't realize that you can't run an economy with all the money just piled up in the banks. It doesn't work that way. So grand theft is now official Cypriot policy, or at least of the bankers. The Cyprus parliament voted this thing down. And they're trying to make a big deal now about all these people who lost their savings, or a portion of their savings. Really, they shouldn't be complaining, because they're getting these unsecured IOUs. The banks owe them the money, and these IOUs are going to be repaid in shares of the bank itself, which, given that it's hovering on the edge of collapse, they're worthless. They're worthless pieces of paper. Put them in a frame, hang it on the wall. Yes, I was part of the great Cyprus bank fiasco here. Now, the small depositors are safe up to this point, and the reason for that is simply under EU law, deposits under 100,000 euros are insured. Similar deal like we have with the FDIC in this country. But if the over 100,000 euro depositors get looted and emptied and the problem isn't solved, they're going to find some way to go after the smaller depositors and somehow void that insurance. Well, the bank didn't really go bust, and it wasn't cheated or robbed or anything. This is official policy, therefore the insurance doesn't cover. And I'll bet you we'll start seeing something along those lines coming out of the FDIC before too much longer. But we're seeing all this opinion around the world. This is from Activist Post, basically saying it's criminal to force the people to pay for government and bank failures, and I've been saying that about here in the United States for all these years, whether you call it TARP or bailout or whatever. They're robbing the people to prop up a failed banking system. I challenge anybody to show me where in the Constitution the government is allowed to steal from the people to prop up private banks. I challenge anybody to find me in the Constitution where a Federal Reserve, a privately owned Federal Reserve, given the Money Creation Authority, is constitutional. The Money Creation Authority is vested in Congress by the Constitution. To change that, to change since a fundamental authority of the government, should have required a constitutional amendment. And I know why they didn't do that. Look at the trouble they had with that 16th Amendment. Couldn't get that ramrodded through. Wound up having to sort of fudge the books on that one. So they decided not to try that a second time. Federal Reserve Act, Christmas holiday, 1913. Wilson signed it. End of story. You're all slaves to the bankers right now. But in general, it's not just Cyprus, not just the United States. Anywhere the government tries to solve the failure of private banks by robbing the people, that makes the government illegitimate. That's not a proper function of government at all. Now, Cyprus is still trying to figure out how, after this mess and everybody's confidence in the banks is completely destroyed, how are they going to kickstart the economy? Well, they're going to legalize casinos in Cyprus. Huzzah, huzzah. We'll just kick off casinos, and people will come down and spend their money and lose their money, and that money will flow into circulation, and so forth and so on. Really? Where are they going to get the money to go to the casinos now that you robbed their savings account? Borrow it? We'll be right back. And aloha, I'm back to the show, and I forgot to mention at the top the phone lines are open, 800-313-9443, 800-313-9443. Manny's sitting in our control room, twiddling the dials, keeping us out of trouble, ready to answer the phone when you call on in. Over in Slovenia, they're now starting to dance around and insist they won't be the next Cyprus. And they may not be. They're in a three-way race for the next Cyprus with Italy and Spain. But the contagion is spreading, contrary to what Bernanke was trying to reassure us the other day. Because that entire economy in Europe is all locked together under a single private central bank issuing the public currencies alone at interest. And when it fails one place, it's going to fail the other. Everything that they've been doing for years now is simply grabbing money from those who have it and shifting over to those who don't. But the debt still increases faster than the available money supply. And I've often used the analogy that Europe is like a wooden boat sitting in the water, and there's a seat for every member nation, and under every seat there's a hole in the bottom of the boat, and they're short one cork. And so everything they're doing amounts to grabbing a cork from one hole under one seat, pounding it into the hole, the water's coming in full view of the press cameras saying we're solving the problem, and yet the water is still coming in and the whole boat is going to sink here. Over in Italy, they're thrashing around with their inability to form a coalition government after the last election. And President Giorgio Napolitano, he's got 6 weeks left in office, and he's trying to basically pull together some kind of a new government out of that election. And, of course, the impetus is we've got to have pro-bankers, pro-austerity, can't let the anti-austerity people in there, even though they captured a huge block of votes in this last election. Now, Gerald Celente is out there pointing out, with some validity, that Cyprus is why gold and silver has a historic value as a storer of wealth. Now we're seeing all of a sudden a surge of propaganda coming into the financial media about how interest in gold is just kind of disappearing and North Korea's taken over from that, and silver, it's acting like a base metal instead of a store of value. And they've got a bunch of numbers showing that the price performance of gold and silver isn't really all that good. It's maybe just holding its own. But there's kind of a wrinkle with that, because over at goldsilverworlds.com there's a very knowledgeable article, and the headline is The Great Disconnect Between Paper and Physical Silver. And the point of this article is that the gold and silver prices are arrived at by establishing the physical price for physical delivery of silver and the paper contracts. And the paper contracts are being oversold, just like they were doing with gold not too long ago. They don't really have enough silver and gold to cover the paper contracts, so they keep sort of kiting them forward, and we think that's where a great deal of the gold bullion that was entrusted to the New York Federal Reserve by Germany and all these other countries may have actually gone. But this article points out how the paper contracts are being used to artificially suppress the market. And of course, we all know the central banks and the one percenters are buying gold and silver as much as they can, and they want to buy it for the lowest possible price. And they're not going to get that price unless they can convince you, the American people, you don't really need gold and silver. Come, silver tarnishes. You don't want that in your house. Tarnish never sleeps. Gold is too soft to really be useful for anything. It's a decoration, and decoration is so déclassé in these hard economic times. But they're buying it up like crazy. And they're manipulating the price, just like they've manipulated the stock market, just like they manipulated LIBOR. They know silver and gold is worth hanging on to, and you probably already know that too. But we're starting to see, again, this idea of, really, silver, gold, yeah, you don't want that. You want the wonderfully performing Dow Industrial stocks. You need to keep your money in the stock market. And by the way, the plunge protection team is doing their job today. The markets are all up, and keeping the banks solvent and the Ponzi scheme going for a little bit longer. Meanwhile, a little dose of reality. Over in the Eurozone, the number of unemployed in the Eurozone has hit the highest level since they began keeping records. And we can pretty much presume that the Eurozone is fudging their unemployment numbers along the same way that the U.S. government is. They have sort of categories they'll dump people who don't have jobs to not count them anymore. We know here in the United States, when you run out of benefits, they stop counting you. When you stop looking for work through their government employment agencies, they stop counting you. So if you're out there trying to set up your own business or you're trying to develop a new product or any entrepreneurial activity, you're not counted anymore as unemployed. So everybody's fudging. All the numbers are out there are just complete lie. Robert Wiedemer, Martin Feldstein, and Peter Schiff, this is over on Investment Watch blog, saying Bernanke's money from heaven. Remember they used to call him Helicopter Bernanke, fly over Wall Street and just shovel the money out the door. It's now being described as the path to the dark regions. Sooner or later, interest rates have to rise. That will start popping the bubbles. They can't keep it going any longer. They've already realized that overprinting is not going to work. Well, what they really decided was overprinting was harming the money junkies as much as everybody else, and that's why they stopped it and started going into this whole let's loot the bank accounts mentality. And David Stockman, who was budget director for Ronald Reagan, is saying that we are in a bubble economy. As bad as it is a bubble. Certainly in the stock market, propped up by all this easy money that's driving the speculators, and the speculators drive the market higher. But they can't sustain it. It is unsustainable. And David Stockman has gone as far as to say the Federal Reserve has become a serial bubble machine. They'll put out a bunch of cheap money. The speculators will use it to create another bubble that they'll make money off. The bubble bursts, and the losses get dropped on the people again. And it's just one after the other, after the other, after the other. The real estate bubble, the mortgage-backed security bubble. Now we've got a student loan bubble. And now they're starting to bubble up what are called high-yield debt sales. Those are the new things everybody's grabbing. High-yield debt, which used to be called junk bonds, are now the hot item. People are grabbing those up and saying somehow we will turn these into money. And it's all driven by the brokers who don't care if the junk bonds really work or not because they just sell, get their commission, and skedaddle. That was a big part of the mortgage-backed security problem. The securitization chain was broken because the people selling the mortgages were off the hook for whether the mortgages ever got paid or not. And that's what led to this insane degree of recklessness. Coots, the high-end private bank, is warning their clients against getting into this high-yield debt market because that's another bubble. In an article I wrote a while back, The Fatal Flaws in America's Financial System, I pointed out several key areas that have led to this instability and all the problems, starting, of course, with the fact that a private central bank issuing the public currency is a machine that by design generates debt. But further down in the article, I pointed out that when you have a market that is dominated by speculators, they live off the volatility. They want the market going up and down in these crazy cycles because they ride those cycles to profit, for which they have returned nothing of any value to society. And that's one of the reasons why the market tends to be unstable, because the insiders can make more money off of instability than a gradual, reliable, predictable market. And so that's another reason why these bubbles keep happening. It's intentional. It may not even be conscious. It may be subconscious, but it's just like gamblers riding the action. They want to go into the highest risk, highest payoff because they're hooked on the adrenaline. And they're not investing for the long term. They're not investing in terms of dividends and return on investment. They want to buy the stock today, sell it tomorrow for a profit, and they're off to the next one. It's not the way the stock market was supposed to be. The stock market originally began as a way for ordinary workers to invest their money in the nation's productivity. It started in the era of agriculture. Hence the name the stock market, because originally what was being traded in the stock market was investing in farming commodities. And that's where it really all began, and it wasn't supposed to be this giant open-air casino that it's turned into. And I'm not the only one who's causing that. Over at mybudget360.com, they've got an article, Casino Economics, how the S&P 500 endured two 50% dips in the 2000s and sent the middle class packing. And they're talking about it. The stock market over the last few decades is operating like a casino, swinging from one bubble to another bubble to another bubble to another bubble. These great fortunes you're seeing from the hedge fund managers and these one-percenters, they're making them off the bubbles. Kick off a bubble, get everybody all hot and bothered to buy into it, wait till it peaks, sell out, it crashes, and everybody else eats the losses. It's a repeating pattern over and over again. There used to be laws against it, and that, too, is a failure of the federal government. Going to take a break for commercials. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. We're going to grab a phone call. Scott in Wisconsin. Aloha, Scott. Welcome back. What's on your mind today?
Hi, Michael. I salute you, brother. Anyways, I got a couple things to talk to you about today. I was watching an article we have, brother, out there in California where the prisons are can't even keep sections of them functioning, so they're taking these less inmates to the county jails, filling them up because they don't have the funding to keep some of these prison sections going. Also, too, brother, did you see that Texas, you talked about this a little while in the back, I guess Texas is now asking for $1 billion in gold from New York. They want their gold back down in Texas.
Yes. I
saw that article on Christopher Greenwave, and he was saying that Texas wants their $1 billion gold back to secede from this corrupt federal government. And I just wondered if you caught that article, because that, I think, if it were to go through, you were talking about these couple countries overseas asking for their gold back. Here, right in our backyard, they're asking now. And I think we'll just watch this situation with Texas, where it could lead into other states. I would like you to comment on that, brother, and thank you for taking my call.
You got it. Absolutely. It is interesting that the state of Texas, which has its own gold bullion, has asked for it back from the New York Federal Reserve. So far, I have not seen where the Federal Reserve has responded one way or the other. In the original article I wrote, the words secession or secede were not there. It's simply that Texas is concerned about the fact that their gold is really there, and they've got really good banks down in Texas, and they want their gold bullion back. And it's a perfectly reasonable request, because the New York Federal Reserve Gold Depository is a depository, and Texas pays a fee to New York Federal Reserve to store their gold safely. But because of all of this concern coming out of tungsten gold bars and the very obvious long delay and stalling tactics that are being used with regard to Germany's repatriation, I think Texas is perfectly reasonable in wanting their gold bullion back under their own control, and it is their right. The New York Federal Reserve does not have any legitimate legal reasons to refuse to return the gold. And so Texas is right to do that. I don't want to tangle it up with the idea of secession, because that would give the federal government a reason to come in and say, well, no, we're not going to give you your gold back if you're planning on leaving and forming your own country. And so I didn't see any talk of secession in connection with the repatriation of the gold. It's a strict financial transaction. I do know a lot of people in Texas think they'd be better off as their own country. I know a lot of people here in Hawaii think they'd be better off without their own country. And both in the case of Texas and Hawaii, the mechanism of statehood shows serious illegalities. Congress even went back and admitted they did not really have the right under the Constitution to simply annex Texas and say you're now part of the United States. So, no, government doesn't follow its own laws and rules. That's just for you serfs and slaves to be paying attention to. But yeah, Texas has a right to have their gold back. I hope they get it. And if they don't get it, I hope they make a really big stink about it as well. Now, speaking of getting your money back, over on Extra Public TV, they have a story where U.S. Senator Inhofe is going public that all these banks on Wall Street have in fact never paid back their bailouts. And we know that in a couple of cases where partial payments were made, the partial payments for a bailout were made out of money from a later, larger bailout. So they're basically just pyramiding that along. So now it's coming out that all of that money that was taken from you to give to the banks so the banks could loan it back to you at interest has never been paid back. They still have it. It's probably gone in bonuses and executive perks and the rest of it. And now we're getting the story that the Attorney General of the United States is saying the country's largest banks may be too big to jail, but the former chief economist for the IMF isn't convinced. He's pointing out there is a huge money laundering epidemic going on in the United States, and it is a criminal activity. And we know some banks, that money laundering and the huge fees they make for it is the only thing propping them up. In fact, I remember many, many years ago, one of my favorite TV series was Miami Vice, the original one with Don Johnson. And and Michael Mann, I had to take my hat off. As he got further into the additional seasons, he started taking on some serious issues. One of the best episodes of that show was Stone's War, which talked about U.S. covert involvement when it was still a subject that was unknown to most Americans. But he did this one show about drug money laundering at this huge bank, and there was this wonderful scene where they meet the president of the bank, and he says, you know, you can't do anything. If you shut us down, the whole economy is going to crash. We're going to take a break for commercials. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. And during the break, I went out to YouTube, and I found that clip. It's from an episode of Miami Vice called The Prodigal Son. And it's an amazing scene. And it harkens back to a time when America's television industry had a lot more courage than they have today. And they were willing to address the issues of U.S. government involvement in Nicaragua, money laundering by the Wall Street banks, and, of course, TV today, it's all politically correct, and Arabs and Muslims are bad, and we're good, and we've got a right to go out and make war on the world. But it was a great show, and, of course, he stepped on a few toes. Michael Mann stepped on a few toes, which is why Miami Vice was eventually taken off the air. Same reason that the original Star Trek back in the 60s only lasted 3 seasons. It was hugely popular, but it was challenging some of the assumptions of our society and is pointing out where we might be wrong. And it was also so intellectually engaging, people would talk about the show right through the commercials. Can't have that. The idea of television shows is you'll be entertained by whatever's there, and when you get to the commercial break, your mind is still completely empty and blank, so you're perfectly receptive for those commercials. And Gene Roddenberry didn't do that, so Star Trek had very high Nielsen's and very low Burke scores. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, the Burke scores are like the Nielsen's, but for TV commercials, to see if people are remembering the commercials, remembering what the product was. And if you have a TV show that's got a high Nielsen and a low Burke score, you can't find advertisers for it, no matter how popular it is. The advertisers don't want a popular show that gets people thinking. They want a show that will deliver up those minds in a receptive psychological state for the advertising pitch, because that's what TV is all about. You go out and you ask, what does television sell? People say, television sells cigarettes, and, well, they don't do that anymore. They sell cars, and they sell smell sweet stuff. In fact, no, they don't. That's the advertiser's job. What the television networks sell is you, your brain, lured in before that set and made receptive for the advertising pitch. That's why advertising commercials are very expensive. They're very well produced. A 30-second TV commercial can often cost more to produce than a 30-minute situation comedy that surrounds it. Got a lot of, or used to be, a lot of money in advertising. I've seen that go into decline in recent years. So anyway, the advice seems to be, I'm going to get off the economy. I know you're sick and tired of me constantly ranting about the private central banks, but it is an important issue. Over at activistpost.com, they're basically saying the same thing a lot of people are saying. Take your money out of the bank while you still can. Because I noticed when Ben Bernanke was up there saying that a Cyprus-style bank levy on savers' accounts was unlikely, and it looked to me like his nose was starting to grow and his pants were starting to smoke. Now, internationally, of course, things are developing. The BRIC nations are setting up their own international bank to rival the IMF. Australia and China are basically negotiating to dump the dollar as the intermediate currency for all of their trade. It's a huge block of trade. Countries are breaking away from the dollar. 10 of the world's top 20 economies have already severed from the dollar. They're moving away from the dollar faster than the U.S. can reconquer them. Over at From the Trenches World Report, they have an article, "The U.S. dollar is now ring-fenced and checkmate." It's a losing proposition. Little event that went mostly unreported on the TV news. The Chinese yuan has hit a record high against the dollar. And that's good for China wanting to import stuff from the United States of America because they've got more purchasing power. But we don't have all that much to send them that they want to buy. Meanwhile, of course, a nation here that has become hideously dependent on imports from China because it was less expensive than domestically produced. Well, all of a sudden, those Chinese imports are just as expensive as products we could have made here if we still had our manufacturing. Now, I want to get on to Korea because earlier in the week, in fact, just yesterday, came out that the statement from last Friday where North Korea said a state of war exists between North and South Korea turned out to be one of those convenient mistranslations that always seem to favor the warmongers. And we really haven't seen much of anything coming out of Kim Jong-un since then. There is a rumor floating around that Kim Jong-un's military top-level command basically threw cold water on him and said, you better cut this out. But, of course, the U.S. wants to move forward with this war against North Korea as a backdoor to war with China. And with Australia and China talking about trade without the dollar, the motivation to get that war with China going is now that much stronger. So the U.S. is moving a lot of hardware into the region. They have deployed the USS Shoup, an Arleigh Burke guided missile destroyer is over there. The SX-1 sea-based radar platform that normally is floating down here in Pearl Harbor is on its way over there as well, and I can talk about that because it's now in the corporate media. South Korea is vowing retaliation for North Korea's provocation. North Korea hasn't done anything. You need to keep that in mind. All North Korea has done is mouth off a lot, and that's really a very poor reason to go to war. Now, apparently, the Philippines have issued an order in South Korea for their citizens to maybe think about getting out. Now, on the other side, China is mobilizing their troops and jets near Korea. They're starting to congregate forces along their border with North Korea. I don't think they're going to invade North Korea. I think China understands the ultimate goal of the United States is war with China. And they're getting ready to do that. Now, the corporate media today is making a big deal over the fact that North Korea is going to reopen their nuclear power plant that's capable of making plutonium for nuclear weapons. South Korea is already saying they may just preemptively attack North Korea. They're bad people. We have a right to go kill them without reason. Now, you need to understand the history of that reactor. North Korea shut that reactor down in exchange for the U.S. loosening sanctions back when the U.S. was making a big deal about North Korea's nuclear program in order to prove to the world that the U.S. wasn't just whooping on Israel's enemy list. But now the U.S. has reimposed those sanctions, and so the deal is off. North Korea is perfectly justified restarting that power station. And that's what it is. It's a power plant. But it raises another question. If North Korea's means of producing weapons-grade fissionables has not been operating for the last few years, then just where did they get that nuclear weapon they just tested? And I'd like to remind everybody that Israel has been caught trying to sell clandestine nuclear weapons to South Africa, and I rather doubt South Africa was the only country that Israel approached. It seems reasonable to presume that Israel is peddling clandestine nuclear warheads anywhere they think they can make a fast buck. And we need to remember that following North Korea's first nuclear test, surveillance overflights captured some of the fallout, and it matched the isotopic signature of a joint Israel-South African nuclear weapon test in the South Atlantic in 1979, which was called the Vela incident. And if you look at maps of nuclear detonations around the world, that South African event in 1979 doesn't show up there, but it was captured on the Vela satellites, which are up there to monitor the world for above-ground nuclear detonations, for which the event was named. So if North Korea didn't have a plutonium-making machine in operation, we have to ask, did they just buy some nuclear bombs from somebody? Now, over in Syria, March turned out to be the deadliest month, 6,005 deaths that they know of. This is a very bloody war between Syria's people and this hired mercenary army. And reinforcing that, we're getting this story out of Press TV. Croatian weapons have now been found in Syria that are being supplied to the Free Syria Army, 95% of whom are not Syrian, I'd like to add. This is just another covert overthrow. Hired mercenaries going on in, oh, look at us, we're a popular uprising, but they don't act like one. When they're killing ordinary people, when they're committing acts of terror, that's not a genuine popular revolution. Because a genuine popular revolution, think about Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, they need the support of ordinary people. They need that public opinion to oust the bad government. And this hired mercenary army in Syria clearly doesn't care about public opinion. They have been paid to go in and try and get Assad. Now, down in Israel, they've apparently embarked on a program of, well, for lack of a better word, it's a program of terror. Israeli occupation forces have rounded up 330 Palestinians during March, including 90 children. They're just going out and grabbing them, and they take them away. Sometimes they're just interrogated and let go, but it's just a campaign of fear, to keep that level of fear up. Don't do anything. We'll come and get you and treat you badly. Haaretz has now admitted that 0.7% of the state land in the West Bank is allocated to the Palestinians. The Israelis get the rest. It's not their land to give away. Under numerous international treaties, an occupied territory has certain rights, including their property rights. And Palestine is now recognized as a legitimate state by the United Nations. Now, over in Yemen, they're starting to mount a huge campaign. They want the Yemeni detainees at Guantanamo Bay returned to Yemen. There's about 90 people. In fact, most of the people at Guantanamo are Yemenis. And Yemen wants them back. And the U.S. is going to dig their heels in on that one, probably. We've been talking about the wind down of the war in Afghanistan. And the Pentagon is now coming out and announcing that the cost of removing all of this hardware in Afghanistan that you paid to build and paid to send over there is going to cost between $5 and $6 billion to bring back. Most of it's probably unusable anyway, after all these years of dust, contamination, and sand. Apparently some of what they're bringing back is not just the fighting gear, fitness machines, furniture, television, computers, all the stuff that was sent over there for the troops at taxpayer expense. And now they're whining and crying that they need money to bring it back home. I understand bringing back the weapons and everything, but the fitness machines and the computers and everything, have a yard sale over there. After bombing all the Afghan people's homes, I'm sure they need a new sofa, a new table. They could use a new computer. Now, we're basically pretty much at, actually just past, the 10-year anniversary of the invasion and conquest of Iraq. And in those 10 years of destruction and murder, the looting of the Baghdad Museum, the forcing of Iraq's oil back on the world market for dollars only, it has become pretty much general knowledge that everybody who was pushing for this war was lying through their teeth. George W. Bush, phony Tony Blair, and of course along with them the corporate media. The corporate media stood shoulder to shoulder with these liars and screamed weapons of mass destruction. They've got bombs, they've got germs, they've got chemical, and of course none of it was ever found. Then they were screaming, oh, Iraq was supporting Al-Qaeda. That turned out to be false. They were ideologically enemies. That claim was based on a single confession extracted under torture. And then they were trying to say Iraq was linked to 9/11. And then George Bush said on TV, actually, no, they weren't. But they're that kind of people. That was the entire rationale. Because we've all been taught that Arabs did 9/11 and Iraq was full of Arabs and therefore we have a reason to go in there. And then finally they flipped it back and said, well, you know, it's regime change and we're bringing freedom and democracy to the people of Iraq, which turned out to be another lie. So after all these lies, it's time to ask the question, why aren't the liars being punished for their lies? Tony Blair is still being treated like a senior statesman. The press fawn all over him. Same with George W. Bush. And the corporate media that's helped send your children to bloody, horrible deaths on the basis of lies, they're still in business. Business is bad. They're losing audience share. They're having to scale back. But none of them have gone to jail. Remember we were talking about that Fox lawsuit over the synthetic bovine growth hormone, where the appeals court ruled, well, there really isn't a law that requires the media to be truthful to the public, therefore they can lie with impunity. I think we need a law like that. I think when we talk about the blueprint for the new America that we have in the actual Constitution, that the corporate media is a public utility to serve the public, and if they are caught misrepresenting information to the public, whether it's Saddam's nuclear weapons or that there's no connection between thimerosal and autism or any of the other hideous lies, that there's no connection between SSRIs and suicides and violence, although they're starting to report that. We're going to talk about that later in the show. Why aren't they punished for all of this? And we need to make sure that it's a mechanism. We need to make sure that the public airwaves are treated like a public utility to serve the public in the new America, just like we need to make sure the money supply is a public utility set up and designed to serve the public. Privatization doesn't serve the people or the nation. It just turns public utilities into private money-making ventures. And we have to make sure that is not allowed to happen. We need a big brick wall between the public utilities of the nation and those greedy money junkies trying to take it all over and turn it into a money-making venture here. Now, over in New York, they're starting to wonder, where are the missing 1,116 9/11 victims? Because we were given a number of how many people died in the World Trade Towers. And normally when a building collapses, yeah, the people are going to be pretty badly distorted, but they tend to find all the bodies. Not in this case. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. Getting back to some domestic news. Apparently there's a huge scandal going on in New York where a New York State lawmaker was arrested this morning along with several other politicians. Apparently they were trying to bribe his way onto the ballot for the race for mayor of New York City. So it's just a reminder about the rampant corruption we see within our government. They did get him. For every one they get, there's probably 10 that get away with it. Meanwhile, there's a very interesting article over at antiwar.com. It's by Justin Raimondo. It's titled Viva Tierra Colorada. And it's basically talking about the rapidly growing vigilante militia movement in Mexico. And it's focusing on the town of Tierra Colorado. This is in Mexico's Guerrero province. where the people just got together. 1,500 armed citizens took to the streets. They set up roadblocks, and they started arresting their local officials. And they were simply stopping people and make sure that people weren't, the criminals weren't trying to leave. They've arrested the former mayor, the chief of police, and 12 officers on charges of murder, collusion with criminals. And a spokesman for the group said, "We have besieged the municipality because here criminals operate with impunity in broad daylight in the view of the municipal authorities." When a government becomes so corrupt that the crime is just right in front, the people can't live in denial anymore. They can't go on saying, "Oh, I believe the police are trying to do the right job. I believe the mayor is trying to make things better." When it becomes so obvious that the people are, when you're rubbing the people's nose in it, the corruption that's going on, you reach a point where they're going to stand up and say, "Yeah, we the people." That's not just unique to the United States of America. We the people. It's our country. And at some point, we're going to have to take responsibility for what's going on and try and do something about it. Peacefully, I hope. But I'm finding it very hard to criticize those citizens down there in Mexico who are fed up with the drug corruption and the political corruption. Now, the corporate media is going on and on about the attack on these two Texas prosecutors. It's being described as meticulous. They don't have a clue. They have a suspect they think might be involved, somebody who was inadvertently released from prison early, that they're saying, "We think it may be him," but there's no evidence of that at all. And as I said yesterday, I have to wonder if the U.S. government, as it sees the states digging in their heels over gun control, that they might be going out to whack some of these prosecutors in order to create an anti-gun bias inside the court system itself. If the judges and prosecutors are all afraid of an armed citizenry, that's going to affect how they rule in these cases on the Second Amendment. Seems to be a very compelling motive to me. Meanwhile, got an interesting little... Oh, got to take a break for station identification. We'll be right back. Join us on the air, 800-313. Welcome back to the show, and we're talking about these killings of prosecutors down in Texas. It's got everybody worried. Horror of horrors, the people are turning against the justice system. And again, I think the U.S. government sees this as an opportunity to sort of build a bias into the court system against gun rights. Because now the judges are all afraid for their lives, the prosecutors are all afraid for their lives, and this is going to affect rulings that are coming down about guns and gun rights and enforcement of federal gun laws. Because the U.S. government is very, very upset with the way that states are digging in their heels to preserve Second Amendment rights. And so they got to figure some way to game the system here. Now, CBS is reporting that the prosecutors down in Texas, at least, are now being encouraged to have a handgun and a handgun license to carry. And they say, got to fill out the forms, you know, get a handgun license, do it within the letter of the law, but you need to have a gun. Wait a minute. Haven't the gun grabbers been screaming that we should surrender all of our guns and wait for the police? Seems like there's a little bit of a double standard going on here. They want the judges and the politicians and the prosecutors and the police to have guns. But we, the American people... No, you don't need guns. The police will come and take care of you. Really, they will. Well, where were the police when these two prosecutors got killed? And maybe they should have been carrying guns before they got shot at. But there's a very clear double standard. They're out there they're down there telling the judges and prosecutors, got to carry a gun. Pack a gun. You got to be ready to shoot back when you're attacked. That should apply to every single American. But it doesn't. Meanwhile, there's this program called the Free Gun Program. They are raising money to give free guns to residents, citizens living in high-crime areas, and especially to single women, so they can defend themselves against criminal. I think this is an admirable situation as long as the people receiving these guns go through a gun safety course. And this free gun program is going to expand into North Texas. And I think it's a very good idea. I think everybody ought to be armed. In a nation where the police are not doing their job, in a nation where the courts have ruled repeatedly the police are not obligated to intervene to save you from a violent crime, it makes sense we should all be armed. Crime will go down. That is the historical pattern. When guns are banned and people are dependent on the police, the crime will go right through the roof. As I've mentioned before, the idea of the wild, wild west where everybody had guns and everybody was shooting, that's fiction. The per capita incidence of gun crime in the Old West was a tiny, tiny fraction of what you see in the disarmed areas of our country, where only the criminals have the guns. A second town in Georgia has approved an ordinance saying gun ownership is now mandatory. Every household has to have a gun. Kennewick started it. Their crime went down. Second town in Georgia is doing exactly the same thing. This is making Obama and his gun grabbers very, very nervous. And they're gearing up for a states' rights fight over this. They're trying to figure out some way they can force local police authority and sheriffs to enforce federal gun laws. And that's not the way this is supposed to work in this country. The states get to decide these things. The local communities get to decide these things, not the federal government. I'm going to take a break for commercials. Join us on the air, 800-313-9443. We will be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. We're going to go back to the phones. Dan in Oregon. Aloha, Dan. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Yes, Mike. Thank you for accepting the call. Really, I have one question. You were talking about a state rights issue in regards to gun control. The issue of state rights is already on the board, which the federal government and state governments are looking eyeball to eyeball. In the case in point, if you would kind of explain it too, was the marijuana laws passed off in the state of Washington as well as Colorado, I believe. Mm-hmm. And there's a state doing what they want, and the feds just standing there not quite sure what to do. That's my question. Have a nice day.
Well, you raise a very valid point here in that the federal government has a long history of continuing to chip away at the states' rights as they were outlined in the Constitution. And I would further argue that if the federal government is passing laws that are unconstitutional, the states have a legitimate right to say, no, we're not going to allow them to be enforced inside our jurisdiction. Certainly in the case of the Second Amendment. It says the right of the people to keep and bear arms, and that means all weapons, not just firearms, all arms, swords, knives, whatever, shall not be abridged. If the federal government is passing laws that abridge those rights, and remember under, I think it's Marburg versus Madison, the U.S. Supreme Court has already said laws repugnant to the Constitution are automatically null and void, and under United States versus Miller, the United States Supreme Court said the Second Amendment reserves to the people weapons equal to those held by the standing army. So,
well, Mike, I think somewhat of the issue is the federal government standing back. It's not an issue of any violation other than state versus federal government. But I think they're more interested in how they can get extra money by selling marijuana with a federal tax. I'm sorry, but that's my feeling.
Well, no, you're probably right on that issue. The issue of marijuana is they don't want you growing your own. In fact, there's already an article we saw earlier today where in one of the states they say marijuana can only be sold in a safety package to protect the children. It's all about taking something you could make yourself and then licensing it and taxing it, whether it's tobacco or alcohol or marijuana. The idea is you're not allowed to make your own. You will go and buy it from somebody who is sharing the wealth with the appropriate level of governments. With the issue of gun control, of course, they're dealing with a completely different dynamic, which is a U.S. government that apparently already back at the G20 last September was openly talking about savings account levies here in the United States, and I'm sure they're convinced that when that happens, the American people aren't going to be tolerating it quite as well as the people of Cyprus are, unless they really start ramping up the dosage of fluoride in the drinking water. And that's the reason for this gun grab. And I think if you go back and look very carefully, we started seeing the beginnings of the gun grab ramping up right after the G20 closed, and that's why I think the two of them are definitely linked.
Yeah, well, I guess the next question is that dealing with freedom and everything else, why aren't the civil law organizations fighting this? They appear to be going just into the background and always picking on schools who want to have school prayers rather than going out there and saying, the Second Amendment holds, and we'll defend those. I don't see them.
Well, one has to ask the reasonable question if the leadership of these organizations is in some way compromised. And their task is to keep everybody in a furor over school prayer and gay marriage and all these other side issues, while the government moves ahead on the real agenda, which is disarming the American people and returning us to the slavery of the private central banks. We know that a lot of these organizations are infiltrated and taken over. We saw that back in the 1960s with COINTELPRO. The FBI would have their on-campus informants specifically join these organizations and by hook or by crook trying to get into positions of authority and control over them. That's how they were able to set up that disastrous protest at Disneyland that was used to completely discredit the peace movement during the Nixon administration. So if you see an organization that says they're out there to protect X and they seem to be completely distracted over here on a less important issue, you need to ask if their leadership is somehow compromised or under control.
Well, that brings out an interesting point, and I'll say this point that Supreme Court Justice Ginsburg, who used to be the head of the American Civil Liberties Union, is still there. I'm wondering if she's still operating it from the bench. That's my end of my questioning. Have a nice day, Mike.
All right, thanks an awful lot. I would say probably that regardless of being on the bench, that some degree of influence is still being exerted. It can be a very, very complex issue, all this revolving door stuff where people are in industry or in organizations, then they're in the government and back again. Those lines of communication stay intact. And I'm sure, any Supreme Court judge can pick up a phone and call their old buddies anywhere in the nation and say, hey, this is what we're thinking is going on. That's part of the old boy network here. All right, I'm going to switch over to Tony in Connecticut. Aloha, Tony. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hello, Mike. I want to ask a question regarding diplomatic immunity as it relates to individual sovereignty. Back in the 70s, when I was a young man or a younger man, I had to drive a wife of a French diplomat to JFK Airport, and she didn't speak any English. And when I got to the airport, I thought I was dropping her off, and it turns out she was just putting her poodle on the plane to be sent to,
okay, I'm sorry.
Sent to Paris. I'm sorry. There's a point here, Michael. I didn't mean to make a joke, but
no, I'm not laughing at you. I'm laughing at her and the poodle.
Yeah, no, I know. It was quite an experience as a young 20-year-old man. Anyway, point being is when I got to the airport, I had to help her carry the poodle to be loaded on the plane, and I asked the police officer, the NYPD officer, where can I park? And he said, you have DPL plates and you can park on the runway. You can do whatever you want. So basically my question is, as it seems like, a sovereign or a diplomat who has immunity or any diplomatic real estate, I don't know what the word, has immunity. It seems like that would be the best way for an individual to go is to give up their citizenship. And I'm sure there's pros and cons to that, and I'm just starting to look into it. But what is your thoughts on a person doing such a thing, Michael?
Well, giving up your citizenship does not make you a diplomat recognized by a foreign government, which is the requirement to have diplomatic immunity. And diplomatic immunity does get misunderstood and it gets misapplied. Technically, you have diplomatic immunity only within your embassy or consulate and a fixed distance away from it. outside of that distance, if you break the laws of the United States, you will be arrested and thrown in prison. It generally doesn't happen for reasons of, keeping things polite and quiet with foreign nations, especially Israel. We've seen that time and time again. But there are rules in place regarding diplomatic immunity. And in point of fact, had you tried to park on the runway, I think you probably would have gotten into some kind of trouble, diplomat or not.
Right.
Does it get abused? Yes, it does. Does the diplomatic pouch get abused? Yes, it does. But, if you're a diplomat for a recognized foreign government, yeah, you get a lot of slack in this country. By the way, a lot of people don't know this. It's actually against the law to arrest a member of Congress while Congress is in session. And that was passed a long time ago because people who are trying to push a particular agenda would very often get their friendly police department to try and interfere with and harass members of Congress who might vote the other way. And so members of Congress, and there have even been a couple of cases where they've caught members of Congress on their way to the Capitol building who are drunk as a skunk, and they won't arrest them. They'll put an officer in the car to drive him the rest of the way. But yeah, there's a lot of laws saying the elites get cut a lot of slack. Remember that J.P. Morgan Chase banker out in Los Angeles was in a hit and run, and they let him go.
Yeah.
He's a banker. He's got to go do banking stuff. We can't arrest him.
Amazing.
Yes.
But as far as the sovereignty, a sovereign citizen, obviously, no, that's an oxymoron. But for someone to give up their citizenship, I've been reading a little bit about that. Do you know anything about that, Michael? Versus a diplomat. I guess that was a fair comparison.
Well, I know there are a lot of people who like the idea of a sovereign citizen, but from the point of view of the federal government, you are all citizens here, period, end of discussion, and you're not allowed to violate the laws just by saying, I don't really recognize myself as part of the United States any longer. I like to consider myself a citizen of planet Earth, but, I still have to obey the stop signs and the seatbelt laws, or I'm going to get a ticket. So it's a nice idea in the abstract, but for very practical reasons, it's not going to change your life to renounce your citizenship. If you're moving to another country and you want to renounce your citizenship, that's a completely different deal. But of course, there are a lot of laws that are put in place to try and discourage that kind of thing. I think right now, if you leave the United States and you want to renounce your citizenship, the U.S. gets to keep, I think it's something like 1/3 of your tangible wealth on departure. It's a huge, huge exit tax to keep you in the place here.
Well, they'll be disappointed in that.
I've heard the same thing when we got a break for commercials here, but when I'm telling people about get your money out of the bank, the savings rates are coming, they say, no problem. I don't have a savings account. I'm scot-free. Marco, welcome back to the show. We're going to go back to the phones. Rick in Illinois. Aloha, Rick. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hi, Mike. Thanks for taking my call. I wanted to ask for your insight on the DARE program. I know it's a little bit off topic what you're talking about, but the drug abuse resistance education program that's offered in grade schools throughout the country. Do you have any particular take on that as opposed, outside of what I might find from my own personal online searches?
Well, I know in Los Angeles a lot of people joke that DARE was Daryl Gates' retirement program. On a darker side, it doesn't really seem to be working. There have been numerous studies that the DARE program, their commercials are completely ineffective. It actually gets kids thinking about drugs when otherwise they might not do so. And it has proven to be completely ineffective, and yet it keeps getting money, and it keeps getting funded, and keeps on going. The joke about Daryl Gates, of course, if you remember, he was the assistant chief of police back when Robert Kennedy was assassinated, and shortly thereafter was made chief of police, and basically rode herd over the Los Angeles Police Department, and then on his retirement, he got involved in setting up DARE. And DARE is the absolute perfect drug education program in a government that is itself profiting from the drug trade.
All right. Well, thank you for your input, Mike.
All right. You got it here. And Manny in the control room just said when he was in school, the joke was DARE stood for drugs are really expensive. And that's certainly true. I heard drugs are really exciting. And again, yeah, it's the perfect drug program for a government that's making money off the drugs. It was completely ineffective. In fact, there were a couple of studies that showed that in schools where the DARE program was operating, drug usage actually went up because it stopped being this remote thing that was way off in the bad part of town that you would never go into. But we see a lot of those things. I remember there was a whole series of commercials. I think it was from the Partnership for a Drug-Free America. And having worked a good part of my career in advertising, I felt competent to judge that these commercials were completely ineffective. They almost seemed designed to be ineffective. To be commercials that said, hey, we're trying to deal with the drug problem, but they really weren't effective at all. You want an effective anti-drug commercial to show to the kids? You take a camera into the drunk tank at the local police and show some strung-out addict going through withdrawal on the floor. That's an effective anti-drug commercial. All righty. Let's see. Getting back to the issue of the police here, because, again, we're caught in this dichotomy. We're down in Texas. They're telling their prosecutors and judges, get a gun. Put a gun on your belt. Get the license. Get a gun. We'll make sure the paperwork will go through. You've got to have a gun to protect yourself. But you, the American people, no, you don't need guns to protect yourself against criminals. You just wait for the police to show up. Over in New York, the New York City Police Department is being sued for pepper spraying a 5-month-old baby. Apparently, the police went into this home and just pepper sprayed the entire family. And apparently it all began when she was pushing her baby stroller through a service gate instead of going through the normal subway turnstile. And trying to get a stroller through those narrow turnstiles is problematic. So she just waited for the service gate to be open, and she went through there, and the cops show up, and they pepper spray her entire family. Yeah, I want to call these people when I'm in trouble. Down in Florida, rather, apparently there's a big stink over a police officer, state highway trooper, was fired for not writing a traffic ticket, a speeding ticket, when he should have. You know, sometimes cops will let you go. If they're in a good mood. You got a good story. Cop will pull me over and come up and say, do you know why I pulled you over? And I'll say, because I'm black. If you can get them laughing, they'll say, get out of here. Don't speed. Don't do anything. Cops will do that. It's at their discretion. But now they're so desperate for that tax, for that speeding ticket revenue, rather. They're pillaging the population, where they fired a trooper who let a speeder go without a ticket down in Florida. Now, here's an interesting little story, and this happened up in Sacramento. Guy has his car parked in front of his house, goes to work. When he comes home, there's a brand new no parking sign installed where his car, next to where his car was, and a parking ticket, $57 parking ticket. I mean, they literally put up the no parking sign, then wrote him a ticket while he was at work. And the county is refusing to say, yeah, you were in a no parking zone. The guy says, when I parked, it wasn't a no parking zone. It's not. We had that other one, that video, amazing video, where they literally were painting no parking around a parked car and then ticketed the car. Next, they're going to be lugging around papier-mâché fire hydrants. And they'll just put it down, write a ticket. That's how desperate they are. Going to take a break for commercials. We'll be right back. Hi, America. Welcome back to the show here. And just on the Republic Broadcasting Store, a lot of good items in there. I have a couple of those products, like the radiation alarm. We bought one back when Fukushima first happened. The battery just lasts forever. It's still working, and so far it has not started screaming that we're all going to melt or anything bad like that. Have some really good shortwave radios in there. Always a very nice thing to have. If you're going to get a shortwave radio, a feature you want to look for, and I know some of the radios at Republic Broadcasting Store have this, you want to get what's called single sideband. which is a form of subcarrier modulation used by ham radio operators, and it basically doubles the amount of information you can get. Because in addition to the various government broadcasts, which is always somebody's point of view, you can listen in to the amateur bands and pick up what they're saying from wherever something is going on. So it's always a good thing to have in your emergency, or just for entertainment. When I was a kid, but in the days before the internet, way back then, you know, in the days of steam-powered terminals and kerosene-powered monitors, I was a big shortwave fan. I built a shortwave from Heathkit, and I love that thing. I'd go out there listening all the time. Anyway, back to some more serious things. We're talking about why being disarmed and waiting for the police is not necessarily the best thing for your health. Up in Pittsburgh, there's been another case where the SWAT team searched the wrong home. They were sent to an address. They were told the police had warrants for 2 houses. Turned out that was incorrect. They only had 1 warrant. And so they kicked down the door of a home for which they did not have a warrant and really harassed people who had nothing to do with the case. And they basically destroyed the house, destroyed the door, destroyed the front windows, and the city came out and boarded up their broken windows. That's about all the apology they've gotten so far. And now they're going to have to literally sue the police department to repair all the damage that was done. Now, interesting little story. This came out of Johnson County, where, and we covered this a little bit earlier, where the Johnson County Sheriff is raiding families growing vegetables in their homes. Apparently they have enough room where they can set up an indoor garden, which during this harsh winter is kind of a smart thing to do. And they were growing vegetables, tomatoes, and all the rest of it. And so apparently deputies barged in, turned it upside down, held them for 2.5 hours looking for marijuana. They had solid intelligence. The family was under surveillance for months for growing marijuana. What made them think they were growing marijuana? Well, because they'd been going over to their local gardening supply and getting bags of potting soil, Grow-Lux lamps. These are these heavy ultraviolet, slightly lavender-looking lamps for indoor growing. They've been getting farming supplies. That was it. How did the police know? Well, see, this is where it gets really interesting, because the only way these police could have known that this family, or these families, plural, because apparently there was more than one, were doing some indoor growing is they're apparently getting the information off the shopping cart and credit card purchases. How are they getting that? Remember all those fusion centers that were being set up to coordinate intelligence? You know, when you go down to the supermarket and they ask for your discount card, that's keeping a record of who you are and what you're buying. And the inescapable conclusion here is that this information, along with your credit card purchases, is going into these fusion centers, no warrant whatsoever to be spying on your personal transactions. And it went to the fusion center and they said, oh, they're buying all this indoor farming stuff, it must be marijuana. And they sent the cops out to kick down the door. And they were wrong. They were wrong. Which tells us once again, these fusion centers are not only unconstitutional, they're incompetent. They make mistakes. They send the police after the wrong people. It is not a crime to be growing tomatoes in your basement or your garage. And that tells us, for all this talk about how the fusion centers are going to protect us from terrorists, they're not looking for terrorists. They're looking for druggies, and they blew it. They didn't find anything. Tore up this family's home for 2.5 hours. All they found was garden vegetables. You shouldn't be growing vegetables in your own home. That's what the supermarket is for. If you're growing your own food, then some giant mega food corporation with GMO produce isn't making money off of you. That's not the American way. Up in Washington State, ugly story. Apparently, police arrived to arrest a parole violator in a home that had multiple residents. roommates. And they go on the back and they find a man lying in his bed. And they're screaming at him, get your hands up, get your hands up. The room is dark. He reaches for a flashlight. They shoot him almost 20 times. He's permanently crippled. Guy was working as a mechanic. Now he can't anymore. His entire left arm is smashed. And, of course, the police department is saying, oh, it was fully justified. It's in compliance with department guidelines that when you're lying in a bed reaching for a flashlight, the police will basically empty their guns into you. A New York state senator has testified in federal court that New York City Police Commissioner Ray Kelly admitted the stop and frisk policy is designed to instill fear in the minority population, targeting African American and Hispanic men. Has nothing to do with crime, has to do with intimidation. Going to grab a phone call here. Peter in Los Angeles. Aloha, Peter. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, Michael. Just real quickly, what about driving a pickup truck in Los Angeles at the same time you're doing it?
It wasn't even the same color truck.
Yeah.
They're just
delivering
shooting
newspapers, and you're women,
Yeah.
But I'm calling you, and by the way, I just emailed this article to you. I just got off of Yahoo. It's cartels dispatch agents deep inside the U.S., and it's talking about mainly Chicago. And they name specifically in the article, they name the Sinaloa cartel, about how they've caught people in Chicago. They're linking the Sinaloa cartel with a spike in the Chicago murders, kill rate and all that's going on there. And I just want to raise a question here, a possible linkage here. We all know that Holder and Obama shipped thousands of automatic weapons to the Sinaloa drug cartel. We don't know in exchange for what. We do know that they routinely do murders all over Mexico and probably around here. But why wouldn't a regime like the Obama regime, which already is doing murders all over the globe, which it already is, in active trading weapons with, the Sinaloa drug cartel, why wouldn't they, for instance,
hello?
collude with them?
Okay.
Hello, you there?
Yeah, you dropped out for just a second.
Why wouldn't the Obama administration? What would they would in murdering people in the United and for instance now Raman.
Okay, Peter, your phone is cutting in and out. I don't know if that's happening at RBN or getting out here to Hawaii. I'm sorry, Manny, you said?
Yeah, it is.
Okay, yeah, apparently it's cutting back. Peter, can you try and call back in and see if we can get a clearer line, because we're having trouble hitting there. But if I understand your question correctly, it is, again, it's this double standard that we, the American people, are not allowed to have semi-automatic weapons, but the U.S. government, at taxpayer expense, is sending these fully automatic weapons down to the Mexican drug cartels. And this cover story about this gun walking to try and trace where the weapons were going, I think it's complete USDA choice bovine excrement. It is a repeat of Iran-Contra, where the U.S. government was sending weapons down across the border, and it was all being paid with drugs flowing back the other way that were then sold in the United States for personal profit. I think it's just the updated version of Iran-Contra. And that's why they don't know where the guns went. They don't care where the guns went. It didn't become a scandal until the guns started showing up north of the border, and U.S. officers started getting killed. Peter, are you back now?
Yeah, I am, Michael. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. So anything else you want to add to that?
Well, I wanted to just raise the possibility that Obama and Holder may be treating with these guys, selling them weapons. It's got to be in return for something. But they specifically, in this article, cite Sinaloa drug cartel, specifically in Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
But why wouldn't he use them? Like the mafia was used by OSS during World War II, and like Gladio used people to extremists. Couldn't they be used? Sinaloa drug cartels be used by the administration to do political murder up in the United States.
No reason not to.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
There's no reason for them not to. It gives them instant deniability. The question is whether these operatives from the Sinaloa cartel are reliable and can be counted on to carry out the assassination without getting caught, because that would become a major, major problem. We know that for many, many years it has been common practice for intelligence agencies wishing to do domestic assassinations to contract it out to a foreign intelligence agent, so they can sort of go along with the idea that, hey, we're still following the laws of the land against assassinating our own people. They did the same thing with the Echelon eavesdropping system, where all these nations got together and set up this network of listening stations. We even have one of them here on Oahu, and the idea is that the American portion of the system would listen to the Australian people, and the people in the Echelon people in Australia would listen to the Americans, and then they just trade the information so they could say, we're not spying on our own citizens. It's just a way of getting around the legalities. And so there's no reason. In fact, we could see a lot of violence in this country that's actually targeted political assassination.
Well, that was my point, Michael, and I thank you for expanding on that.
Okay.
I'm signing off, but thanks a lot.
All right. Thanks an awful lot there. Now, getting back to police and law enforcement, you probably saw on the TV news they're screaming about how a bookkeeping error has allowed some serious criminals to be released early. I'm sure they're going to go out and try and find them again. But there's another more interesting story here coming out of arstechnica.com, basically saying that thousands of California sex offenders and felons on parole are finding it very easy to disable their GPS monitors. Frankly, I think if you put like 3 or 4 layers of aluminum foil around that, the GPS signal stops. And they're basically finding out that it's incredibly easy. Because of prison overcrowding, they said, we're going to start letting people out, but you got to wear these GPS monitors so we know where you are and where you're going. We'll make sure that you're not going over to the schoolyards and molesting little kiddies or joining the priesthood so you can molest more kiddies there. And they're finding out it's actually very easy to disable these GPS tracking devices. And what happens is they lose the signal from the GPS, and they figure it's just the poor quality of the system. They don't know where to go to find these guys. So these guys are going out and doing what they want to do, and they go back home, take the tinfoil off. Oh, they're back home. System is working again. Now, in one of the most absurd stories I have ever seen, this is over in Mississippi, where the police arrested a 5-year-old child for wearing the wrong color shoes to school. And apparently the schools have a dress code, which I understand. My school had a dress code when I went there. And apparently you're required to wear black shoes to school. And because he did not have black shoes, and his family could not afford to buy black shoes, his mother used a black marker to sort of color his red and white sneakers black. But the red and white were still visible, so the child was taken out of class by the police and driven home by the police to teach the mother a lesson. How wonderful life must be in Mississippi that the police don't have anything better to do than enforce the dress code on 5-year-olds. Must be no murders down there, must be no rapes, must be no muggings or burglaries or any of that stuff going on. So the Mississippi police have to justify their police paychecks by harassing the kids at school. If I'd been there, I would have bought the kids some black shoes. Problem solved. And by the way, one of the programs that my wife and I are involved here locally, because at our school, you know, Hawaii's very casual, a lot of bare feet, but it can be dangerous because of broken glass. And at this school that we were involved in, where the food insecure kids were handing out the food bags because they run out of food stamp money in week number 3. So we're sending these food bags home so they can have enough sugar and energy and nutrition so that they can still be good students in week number 4. A lot of them don't have shoes at all. And so we got everybody to pitch together for a big cardboard box full of little flip-flop sandals. Kid comes to school without shoes, they get a free pair of sandals. That's how you solve these problems. You don't have the cops come in and say, you're walking on the streets on bare feet. And I find it amazing that any police officer, at least as we are told they are supposed to be by TV, would do something like that. If the kid doesn't have black shoes, if he can't afford black shoes, that's not a crime. Now, meanwhile, over in South Carolina, and this gets back to the issue of states' rights, South Carolina is moving closer and closer to nullifying Obamacare within the borders of their state. The Constitutional Law Subcommittee of the House Judiciary Committee passed House Resolution 3101, the Freedom of Healthcare Protection Act. And it's moving forward. They're confident it is going to pass. And it will set up another confrontation between the federal government and the states as to who's in charge of the states. And remember, under the Constitution, rights and authorities were reserved to the states. That's what the 10th Amendment is all about. And the presumption is, as enshrined in the 9th Amendment, that any rights not enumerated go to the states or the individual. Going to take a break for commercials. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. We're going to go back to the phones. Alex in Florida. Aloha, Alex. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Not much, Michael.
Well, thank you for calling.
Thank you. We need to solve 9/11.
We already have.
The mass majority of Americans don't think so, especially the elderly people that are internet illiterate.
Well, first of all, I think it's a myth that elderly people are internet illiterate because I'm elderly, and I have quite a few people my age and older who are very much on the internet. They've caught up. As of the last poll that I saw, the people who still buy the official story of 9/11 are a rapidly dwindling minority.
Where did you see that poll at? Just out of curiosity.
I think the last one I saw was which polling organ? I think it was a Pew Research poll that basically measured if people still trusted the government on the 9/11 issue. And it basically said people who absolutely trusted the government's version of events were something like 30%. And the rest were divided between absolutely convinced the government is lying and not sure one way or the other. And that doubt, of course, works in our favor. We don't need to know every fine detail of 9/11. Pretty much everybody out here is in agreement that the government has lied about it to one extent or another. And
we need to put people in jail.
Absolutely we do. Absolutely we do.
And we need to put them on death row until we get the truth. You know? Do you want?
We've got the truth. We've got the truth. We don't need another government investigation. We don't need any. We know the government lied to us about 9/11, and that's really the important point. And the rest is just fine details. We know that our own government admitted there was evidence linking 9/11 to these arrested Mossad agents. We know our government was part of the plot because of the way the Secret Service behaved at Booker Elementary School. That's really it. We know we were lied to. Let's unite around that point and move forward.
Okay, let's move forward. And moving forward is putting handcuffs on people, and putting them in jail, and putting their face in the post offices all over the country and the world.
Well, I think if they're already in jail, we don't need to bother with that whole post office thing. And frankly, I'll be very honest. I've been going to the post office for years. I've never actually looked at any of those posters they have up there. So, I don't know what good that would do. But, we know we were lied to. We also know under the current corrupt political regime, the guilty will not be punished. George W. Bush lied to Congress in 2003 when he activated the resolution for the use of force in Iraq by claiming Iraq was in possession of weapons of mass destruction. And he was lying to Congress, and Congress did nothing about it. And so as long as the federal government stands, these people are going to be protected. After it all comes crashing down, after we get the new country going, we may simply say, all right, we need to get some of these people back here and sort of, give them a wedgie for what they did to us and how many of our young people had to die for this. Got to take a break for station identification. We'll be back to the show. Hour 3. Dan the Man is now in our control room, ready to answer the phone when you call in to 800-313-9443, 800-313-9443. I want to talk about the carbon Nazis. They're obviously getting ready to come back and try and sell this whole carbon tax, carbon credit, blah, 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 blah. We've had another very rough winter. It is still not over in many parts of the world. And all of those scientists who hitched their funding and their reputation to Al Gore and his global warming scare are getting desperate to keep their funding, to salvage their reputations. And they're getting desperate out there. This is a story from ArsTechnica.com. The oceans continue to warm, especially the deeps. This is a continuation of their latest talking point. Yeah, we've had a lot of snow and ice up here on the surface of Earth, but the world is getting warmer, and that heat, that warmth is hiding deep in the ocean. That's their latest comment here. And here's a quote from the article. When discussing global warming, the public eye is mostly directed to global average surface air temperatures, but that's just one tiny slice of the climate pie. If you haven't noticed, the ocean is awfully big, and it holds a great deal more heat energy than the atmosphere. That's true. In fact, about 90% of the energy that's been added to the climate system by human activities has gone into the ocean. That part is not true. For the reason I pointed out yesterday, how many active volcanoes and thermal vents are on the floor of the world's oceans? And don't feel embarrassed if you don't know the answer. It's a trick question. Nobody knows. Nobody knows how many active volcanoes and thermal vents there are on the floor of the world's oceans, pouring heat into the water. They didn't even know there were thermal vents until Dr. Robert Ballard found them. They're still finding active undersea volcanoes. To this very day, they finally realized the El Nino current comes from a chain of active volcanoes off the coast of New Zealand. They didn't know we're down there. And if nobody knows how many volcanoes and how large they are and the thermal vents are down there pouring all this intense volcanic heat into the water, then nobody can really point to a particular temperature of the ocean and claim it is the result of human activity. It's just more USDA choice bovine excrement. And the reason they're doing this thing about, oh, the world is warmer, but the heat is hiding from you. It's being sneaky. It's waiting down there until you drop your defenses, and then it will leap out of the ocean and scorch the earth in a single day. The fact is, the dire warnings of the carbon Nazis have cratered spectacularly. Back in 2000, they were screaming snow would be a thing of the past. Al Gore repeated that in 2009. We still have snow. In fact, this last winter, we had more of it. Look at all the snow records that were set. 10 years ago, the former head of Greenpeace claimed Greenland would lose all of its ice in 20 years. We're halfway through that 20-year prediction, and Greenland still has all of its ice intact. Temperatures have not gone up, although CO2 actually has, for almost 20 years now. And as people are struggling with their snow shovels as winter lingers on, they're wondering if we're actually headed into a repeat of the Little Ice Age. And so all those scientists who bet their funding and reputation on Al Gore's carbon trading scheme are desperate to save face, to find some way to keep screaming, we were right about global warming, even as the world demonstrably cools. So now we have evil warmness lurking deep in the ocean like some mutant pelagic shark, biding its time until it can roast you with a sudden onslaught of stored heat. Except there's a flaw in this idea of heat hiding in the deep ocean, and it's called warm water rises. And we'll be back after these words from our sponsors. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. We're talking about Nazis who are desperate to raise on a busted flush. And they're still getting, of course, support from the Obama administration because Barack Obama wants to pass a carbon tax. They're taxing everything that moves right now, and even some things that don't move. They're out to grab the money, grab the money, grab the money, higher taxes on this, higher taxes on that. IMF wants $1.40 a gallon tax on American drivers to fight global warming. And so they got to come on outstairs and go, yes, global warming is real. Pay no attention to those icicles falling off your nose and your eyelashes. The world is warmer. What are you going to believe, your own eyes or our pretty printed pieces of paper here? Now, as we mentioned, they're still trying to push this idea that warming leads to cooling, that the increasing ice caps are because, well, you know, the heat melted them, and really nonsensical stuff. And either the people writing these articles are scientifically illiterate, or at least they're hoping that you all are scientifically illiterate and don't understand the failings of their claims here. There's a new piece of propaganda that's coming out now. This was actually over at Yahoo. And the headline reads, "Even doubters want to prepare for global warming." And what it's basically saying is that even though a lot of people think this global warming is a hoax, most Americans will support being prepared just in case. In other words, now they're trying to sell the idea that, well, maybe the world isn't getting warmer, but you should pay a carbon tax anyway just in case. Just in case. You know, your heart may be healthy, we're going to give you statins just in case. That's the new push. That's what they're really saying. Even though the dire warnings of the global warming cult have failed, even though they predicted snow is a thing of the past, we got record amounts this year, even though we have the former head of Greenpeace on video admitting the whole thing about Greenland losing its ice sheet was just a made-up scary story, even though the world stopped heating up 20 years ago, even though the real-world signs show the start of a new little ice age, even though solar activity and oscillations in the Earth's orbits are the dominant controls of climate, people are still going to be okay paying a carbon tax just in case. That's how absurd it is getting. Now, remember I said, in addition to the financial gain, remember, Al Gore set up his carbon exchange with the help of Ken Lay from Enron. And the agenda there is to loot planet Earth using carbon dioxide the way Enron looted California using electricity. That's what it's all about. That's the financial dimension. But there's a political dimension. And that is to get the world to agree to live under a global environmental authority as a stepping stone to global government. This push for the new world order rested on 3 pillars. A global flu pandemic requiring obedience to a global health authority. That one didn't work out. A global financial crash, which would lure us all into swearing undying fealty to a global version of the Federal Reserve. That one's not working out either. Because most people are realizing globalism is what turned America's financial corruptions into a global calamity. More globalism won't fix it. That's like backing the Titanic up and whacking the iceberg on the other side in the hope that it'll stop the leaks. And, of course, the third foundation was global warming requiring obedience to a global environmental authority. And here we are hearing it come out over at Market Daily News. They're talking where scientists are saying there needs to be an exclusive club to assume command of global geoengineering to fight global warming. Blah, 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 blah. Now, as I said, these scientists are desperate to preserve their reputations. They hitched their credibility, their reputation to global warming. It's not working out. And over at NASA, James Hansen has found the ideal solution. He's leaving. He's retiring. He was the one in NASA who was out there screaming the loudest about global warming. It's a disaster. We've got to do something. Now he's skedaddling. The official story is he's leaving to focus more attention on global warming. No, he isn't. He's getting out of Dodge before NASA's reputation is destroyed by the avalanche of snow. And that's what's going on over there. And it may have to do with another study that did come out of NASA showing that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is actually acting as a coolant. And this is a good illustration of why these computer models, which are the entire foundation for screaming global warming, are bogus. They're set up to create a simulation that will support the global warming agenda, but they don't operate as real world. And a good example would be, we all know what greenhouse effect is. If you have a frame and it's covered with glass or plexiglass, light coming through is converted to infrared. The infrared warms the interior, and you can have veggies and stuff all through the winter. And that property of converting light to infrared is mimicked, similar, that you see with the greenhouse gases, water vapor being the most prevalent. Methane, far more potent than carbon dioxide, and carbon dioxide is in the mix as well. But carbon dioxide was chosen for a very simple reason. You're not going to get the people of planet Earth to pay a tax on water vapor. I didn't make that cloud. It's not my fault. I don't owe you anything on it. Methane was avoided because most methane comes from termites and deep crust microbes. And these are life forms that are far too intelligent to fall for these scams like global warming. So they settled on carbon dioxide because that one could be blamed on human activity. Even though the human contribution to planetary carbon dioxide is a fraction of 1%. Oh, it's the tip over. We've got to tax carbon dioxide. That's really what it's all about. And they said carbon dioxide in the atmosphere acts like a pane of glass in a greenhouse. And in fact, it doesn't, because a pane of glass in a greenhouse isn't moving. Does not allow air to flow from one side of the pane of glass to the other. Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere doesn't actually do that. It circulates. It convects. And so this NASA study that went out and looked at the actual behavior of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as opposed to a computer that modeled somebody's wishful thinking, found out carbon dioxide's actually cooling the atmosphere. There's a good one for you. Now, what drives climate on Earth? First of all, you need to understand something. Climate is always changing on planet Earth. It has for the entire estimated 4.5 billion years Earth has been in its current form. And climate is going to go on changing long after humans have gone extinct. There has never been a period in geological history where the climate stayed the same. It just doesn't happen. The balance of nature is a romantic notion, but it's not real world. Nature is chaos. Nature is change. Nature is banging down through the halls of time, colliding with the furniture and the rock outcroppings. It is not stable. It's very unstable. And so this idea that climate can be controlled is nonsense. The dominant forces of climate control on this planet are the sun, that big, bright, hot thing up in the sky. And I remember it wasn't too long ago, some of the carbon Nazis were screaming that the sun has absolutely no influence on climate here on Earth. Really? Take the sun away. Watch what's going to happen to the climate. It's going to get real cold real fast. Now, when the sun is very active, a lot of sunspots, a lot of turbulence, fewer cosmic rays reach the surface of planet Earth because the Earth's magnetic field is all riled up. When the sun is quiet, as it is right now, even though this is supposed to be the solar max year, the maximum of the 22-year sunspot cycle, and the sun isn't cooperating. When the sun is quiet, more cosmic rays reach the surface of planet Earth. Cosmic rays stimulate cloud formation. Think back to those little cloud chamber experiments in high school physics. Or if you're in Los Angeles, you go to the Griffith Park Observatory, they've got a wonderful cloud chamber that just shows the little streaks of vapor caused by these cosmic rays passing through a saturated atmosphere. So if you have cosmic rays reaching the Earth stimulating cloud formation, clouds are white. They're reflective. More of the sun's light is reflected away from the Earth back out into space, and the Earth will cool. The little ice age in Europe is associated with a very quiet period of solar activity called the Maunder Minimum. And CERN recently reconfirmed this idea that cosmic rays are what stimulate cloud formation in the sky. That's why clouds appear here, but not here. It's a very, very complex mechanism, but the more cosmic rays you have, the more clouds will form. It's the way it works. Cosmic rays also open the ion channels for lightning bolts. That's why they're jagged. It's actually a collection of multiple overlapping ion channels caused by cosmic rays. That's why during this kind of extreme cosmic ray activity, you get more interesting looking thunderstorms. The second thing controlling climate on Earth, and this is the biggie, contrary to popular belief, the Earth's orbit is not entirely stable. It oscillates in shape from circular to elliptical over tens of thousands of years. When the Earth's orbit is more elliptical because of orbital mechanics described by Kepler, the Earth spends more time further away from the Sun, and that's where you get the ice ages. Then when the Earth's orbit becomes more circular and Earth is spending more of its time closer to the Sun, you get the interglacial periods. So until the carbon Nazis can control the output of the Sun or change the shape of Earth's orbit, there's nothing they can do to really control climate. This whole carbon dioxide is the cause of all evil. It's just another scam to take your money and trick you into obedience. And that's all it ever was. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the show here. We're going to go back to the phone. Kit in California. Aloha, Kit. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, how you doing today, Mike?
Doing okay.
I was wondering if you've ever heard of the World Government of World Citizens.
It doesn't really ring a bell. I mean, I've heard of both terms. I've never heard them strung together like that before.
Okay, well, I came across this website not too long ago. It was started by a former B-2 bomber pilot from World War II, who, after he was done with the service, says, I want no part of this any longer. He renounced his U.S. citizenship and declared himself a quote-unquote world citizen. Since then, there have been about just under 1 million people that have joined and declared themselves world citizens. They issue passports, birth certificates, IDs, and I was actually thinking about joining. I was just wondering if you had any opinion about it.
Well, it's a very wonderful romantic idea, but I think at this point we can look at the state of the world right now, and as much as we'd like the idea of everybody thinking of themselves as citizens of planet Earth and getting along peacefully, the practicality of the situation is that what we need is a planet with 1,000 or more independent nations that have borders between them. For the same reason we put fireproof doors in buildings and watertight bulkheads in ships, because...
I'm sorry, Mike, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead.
Basically, the idea is if there is a one world government and one world banking system, there are some problems with it. First of all, what happens when the next Adolf Hitler comes along and takes control, as will inevitably happen? There won't be anybody else on the world to stand up against them. Second, because there are no alternative cultures anywhere, social evolution will come to a halt. Globalism is anti-evolution in the societal civilization sense. Governments tend to basically become fossilized. They want to keep things the way they were. Look how desperate our government is to try and get things back to the way they were at the height of the Cold War in the 1950s and 1960s. They can wave Russians at us and scare us out of our money and obedience. And obviously, as I said before, the dropping of financial borders between nations is why the mortgage-backed security fraud collapse in New York triggered the events in Europe, and again, because all of those financial borders have been dropped, what's happening in Cyprus is already spreading to France, rather to Spain and to Italy and to Slovenia, and will eventually come here. And so as romantic as the idea of one world united together would be, and it can be spiritually and philosophically, but for reasons of practical consideration, I think the planet is much better off with 1,000 little tiny nations, each looking after their own, not dependent on the other nations, so that if there is a calamity in one of these nations, the rest can go in and help and not get dragged down with it.
No, I understand, and I do agree with you. However, this isn't, it doesn't have a central legislating body. It's not widely recognized, so it's more of just an independent declaratory statement of I am a citizen of the world. I'm not just a tax number or something to be fed off of.
Well, it's a very romantic notion, and in that context, I think it's a cool idea.
And they have a, if you check out the website, it's pretty interesting. It's worldservice.org, and they even have an idea for a commodity currency, which is the 10 kilowatt dollar.
Okay.
Just food for thought if you want to check it out.
No, I'm certainly a supporter of using electricity as the asset of value to back a new monetary system. And for a philosophical point of view, I like the idea of a single planet. And like I said, I like to consider myself a citizen of planet Earth. But again, when you get into the realm of industry and agriculture and finance, and certainly guarding against the rise of a new supranational tyranny, I think we're better off as a planet with 1,000 small nations rather than a world being fought over by a couple of empires.
I agree.
Okay?
I just wanted your opinion.
That's my opinion.
Good day.
That is my opinion, and I will admit it under oath. Now then, I want to talk a little bit about an article that came out, again, this is on CBS, where the U.S. government is finally starting to look into the issue of whether cell phone radio waves might be harmful. And it comes under the heading of new knowledge and new awareness can sometimes overturn earlier declarations. And the reason for that is very, very simple. When you talk about the potential harm of radio energy to life on Earth, up until recently, the calculations were all based purely on the idea, was there enough energy in the radio waves to break a molecular bond? Obviously, in your microwave oven, yes, but the wisdom out here in the rest of the world is if there isn't enough energy to start breaking molecular bonds, then the radio transmitter is very, very safe. Then, of course, we started looking at these terahertz naked body scanners that TSA is subjecting us to, and the strange sudden emergence of clusters of cancer among the TSA workers, which we all feel bad for. Got to take a break for commercials. More about this when we come back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And we're talking about a new investigation into the health effects of cell phone radio waves being undertaken by U.S. regulators. And remember, the regulators are probably going to be listening to all of those cell phone companies who are a major, major wealthy series of corporations to say, it's perfectly safe. There's no reason. But let's talk about the science, what's going on. Up until now, in fact, let me preface this with a reminder. If you're my age, you probably remember a time when you could go into any shoe store in America and you would see a fluoroscope that you would just put your feet in the little box, and then you could look through this little set of goggles, and you would see a real-time live X-ray of your feet. And the idea was that this was the perfect way to fit the shoes to your feet so that you would be comfortable standing at your job all day long. There was even a film put out by the U.S. Surgeon General encouraging people to use these machines. And then in the 1960s, all the shoe store salesmen started coming down with cancer. And it took until the 1980s for the last of these things to be retired. And the government said, they're safe, they're perfectly safe to use. Go ahead, use them, they're wonderful. There was an early Michael Caine movie called $1 Billion Brain, where one of these shoe store fluoroscopes is part of the storyline. And you can still find pictures of them out there, and History Channel actually had one on one of their little programs a while back. It's just a reminder, just because the government says something is safe doesn't mean it's so. So anyway, we're talking about whether or not radio waves can be harmful to you. And up until now, the benchmark standard has been if the radio wave does not have enough energy to sever a molecular bond, it's considered a safe level of exposure. Then all of a sudden, when TSA started getting these terahertz radio naked body scanners, all of a sudden, some of the TSA workers began in Boston, it's now hit other cities, started coming down with higher incidence of cancer than the general population. And we've been seeing denial, oh, it's got nothing to do with it, it's got nothing to do with it. But Johns Hopkins Medical School and MIT both started looking into this, and they discovered there was a new, previously unknown phenomenon that needed to be looked at. It's called molecular resonance. Now, if you want to know what resonance is, there's a very famous disaster involving a bridge in the Tacoma Narrows, Washington. It was called Galloping Gertie. And the bridge was built to withstand the stress of the winds that they would get in the Tacoma Narrows. But what they didn't plan for was resonance, the idea that the bridge would start oscillating. That's where it got the name Galloping Gertie. And it only took a little bit of wind to keep amplifying this natural resonance of the bridge until finally the bridge tore itself apart. And it turns out long-chain molecules do exactly the same thing. And what MIT and Johns Hopkins discovered is that radio waves of considerably less energy than it takes to physically break a molecular bond can start the molecules oscillating and vibrating. And they can pump more energy in over time, and the individual energy is still not enough to break the molecular bonds, but if the molecule gets vibrating enough, it starts to break those molecular bonds. And you get damaged DNA, damaged proteins, and this is a whole new phenomenon they didn't understand before. And so now what is an acceptable level of exposure to radio waves may have to be revised downward. And a lot of people are saying, where does cancer come from? Because it's known cancer was very rare in ancient times. Is it environmental? Well, you can test your cell phone and say, is that a threat? You can test your walkie-talkie, is that a threat? But do you realize how completely saturated with radio energy you are right now sitting in your home? You've got all the commercial AM and FM broadcasters transmitting around you. They're all broadcasting at once. You're only listening to one station, but the radio waves from all of those stations are impinging on you. All the police and fire and emergency first responders transmitters and their base stations are radiating. Radars constantly radiating. Military communication radiating. Commercial VHF radios all around you. The radio spectrum is completely saturated. They're running out of room and bands, and you are constantly being showered with all of that radio energy. And if they're finding out that very low energy radio waves can, through this process of molecular resonance, start damaging your DNA, then all of a sudden the door opens to a possible explanation for why there's so much cancer, particularly in the industrialized cities where you have the highest density of radio energy. Shortwave, satellite, even the little radar above the door at your supermarket when you walk in and the door is open. That's now radar. It used to be a little mat on the ground you'd stomp on to open the door. Now it's a little radar above the door. And of course, because radio and TV are inextricably a part of our society, there'll probably be a tremendous amount of political information not to look at that, or political influence not to look at that, just as we see with SSRIs and violence. But we need to look at that as a possibility. We need to correlate the rise of cancer with the rise of powerful radio and TV transmitters. Now, as you know, there has been a project to map the human genome. And one of the findings coming out of it, there used to be this idea that most of your DNA was considered junk. And the conventional wisdom was that 97% of your DNA didn't seem to do anything, was not involved in protein synthesis, which is what builds your body and your tissues. Now they're beginning to realize that what they thought was junk DNA does do something. This is coming out of From the Trenches World Report. And they're saying it does seem to have a biological function. They're not exactly sure what it does. It's not protein synthesis, but it's getting in there and it's causing some changes. Well, this actually makes a lot of sense because we are all born with instincts. The instinct to breathe, the instinct to eat, the instinct to survive, the instinct to procreate. That has to be in there somewhere. And maybe this 97% of the DNA that isn't involved in the actual building of proteins and bone and tissue is, if you'll pardon the expression, the operating system for the human mind. Now, I know the liberal political philosophy embraces a concept called tabula rasa, that you're born with a completely empty brain and everything that you think and feel and know is the result of absorption from the culture around you. This all goes back to Margaret Mead and her book Coming of Age in Samoa, which is a holy Bible of liberal political thought, even though it's since been exposed to have been a complete fraud. So setting that whole issue aside, you are born with a lot of inherent knowledge. You're born with inherent memories, things that you've picked up from all of the evolution. It's got to be coded in there somewhere. And this looks like a good place to start. So I'm not surprised that they're all of a sudden saying, oh, yeah, that stuff does do something after all. Let's see, the World Health Organization has now suspended a vaccine. It's a 5-in-1 vaccine, Quinvaxum. And apparently over in the developing world where this stuff is being handed out, 26 children have died. Far more have experienced severe reactions, including fevers, vomiting, and bruises all over their body without an impact. Petachia, hemorrhagic bleed out. Wonderful, wonderful stuff. Now, another story that we got here. ADHD seen in 11% of U.S. children as diagnosis rise. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. When I was a kid, we called it the teacher is boring the crud out of me. And we know education is being dumbed down. They just busted all those school people down in Atlanta for rigging the tests that made it look like their school district had turned around and was educating the kids. It wasn't. They're just rigging the tests there. I remember when I taught briefly at the high school level back in Southern California, all the energy was in trying to get the dullards to wake up and do something, and all of the really smart kids were being neglected. So, of course, they're looking out the window, and they're trying to amuse themselves. They're bored out of their minds. I actually got slammed on for trying to hold a little lunchtime workshop for the smart kids to teach them some extra stuff, like how to use a slide rule. I know you have to be my age to understand what a slide rule is. And so the kids are bored. The smart kids are bored. And they start acting out, and they start saying, well, you know, I can't just sit here and do nothing for the entire school day. I already know everything you're teaching these other people. So they're not going to blame the education system. They're not going to blame the teachers. They're not going to blame a political philosophy that focuses all the educational effort on kids who just don't want to learn. So the smart kids who are bored, oh, they've got a mental illness. They have ADHD. Let's give them SSRIs. And SSRIs are big business. And so, of course, they're going to say, oh, yes, it's an epidemic. All the kids are getting 11%, and it's going up. We've got to get all these kids on the medications. By the way, one of the more independent Fox News affiliates just came out with another report on the link between these SSRI antidepressants and acts of extreme violence and suicide. We posted it to the front page of whatreallyhappened.com, and we added it to that resource page for SSRIs and violence. They know this is a problem. The gun grabbers know this is the real cause of the problem. But the word has gone out. We will not acknowledge a link between these prescription antidepressants and violence, because our good buddies over there at the pharmaceutical industries will stop writing those very generous checks to us, and the agenda here is to blame the guns. Guns are the cause of gun violence, just like cars are the cause of drunk driving, and swimming pools are the cause of drowning. Now then, on to the subject of computers. As you're probably aware by now, Israel and the hacktivist collective Anonymous are going head-to-head. Anonymous broke into the Mossad's computers and got a list of known agents that's now gone viral all over the net. Israel is now screaming they're bracing for a potentially crippling cyber attack that is supposed to peak on April 7th, this weekend. We'll see what comes of that. Talk about the pot calling the kettle black, because Israel's one of the biggest hackers out there. Not just at the government level. Israel has the highest per capita population of cyber criminals operating inside there. Meanwhile, the Department of Homeland Security is now using video games to recruit kids to be cyber warriors for the United States, which means those high scores that you're getting on your computer game are going up that wire to somebody so they can come knock on the door and say, hey, we have a job for you. Now, down in Texas, there's been a very, very interesting court decision. This is for all you Linux people. And there is a company called Unilock USA, and they basically are making all their money suing everybody over what they claim is patent infringements on things that are supposed to be in the public domain, and Unilock will try and patent them and then sue everybody. They've gone after Adobe, Microsoft, Sony, Symantec, and now they went after Rackspace. And Rackspace uses Linux for their servers. And basically, Unilock tried to sue them for patent infringement over something that's built into Linux. And fortunately, the judge saw through this, and the Red Hat Linux people went to court to support this, to say that this is prior art. You can't just patent something that's in existence and start suing everybody. If it's documented to be in the public domain, it is beyond the reach of a patent. Sometimes they get really silly. I remember in the early years of computer animation, there was a company that tried to patent the concept of anti-aliasing and say it now belongs to us. You've got to pay us a license for any anti-aliased image out there. And, of course, that one didn't go very far in the court. But they do get very, very silly. And what's morally reprehensible is these people trying to patent these technologies didn't develop the technologies, which is what patenting is supposed to be, to protect something you yourself invented, not just go out and find something that's useful and grab it and patent it. There have been some disasters. VisiCalc was the first spreadsheet, was out on the original Apple II. Their developers didn't patent it. And another company came along and produced a similar product and said, we've patented it, it's now ours. They grew insanely rich. The original VisiCalc people went out of business. So it's very predatory out there. We're going to go to the phones. Don in Ohio. Aloha, Don. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Oh, yeah, I just had a question for you. I know you had some problems with the router and stuff like that before.
Yes, I did.
And I got something going on right now on mine that is really odd, and I was wondering if anybody else has experienced anything like this. I've got a couple computers on the internet right now, and other ones are fine. But I went back to my one laptop here. It says that the internet is blocked by Cisco. It says access to the internet is blocked this time. Enter the parental control passwords. Make all blocked websites and content available for 1 hour. Well, I got no parental controls on my computer at all. I was wondering if it happened to anybody else.
Okay, what you're probably dealing with, all of the newer routers come with parental controls built in, and in order to alter them, you need to log into the router itself. The router is going to appear on your LAN as another IP address, and there should have been a little instruction book that came with the router that said to access the router's control panel, you open up a web browser and you go to 192.blah, blah, 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 and you will get a little control panel, and that's where you access this stuff. But Cisco is definitely leading the forefront of routers that are supposed to take care of us, even if we don't want it to. And
this is a Linksys, and I've been using it. It's fine on my other computers. It's only on one computer.
It's only on one computer. You are going to need to look at the permissions for that computer as it appears to the Linksys router. And, again, you're probably going to have to go back to Linksys to look at this. But that sounds to me like it's a router misconfiguration. You said before Cisco was blocking you, and
yeah.
Okay, well, isn't Cisco doesn't Cisco now own Linksys?
Oh, I don't know. Maybe they do.
Yeah.
But it's an old Linksys. I mean, it's not like anything new. I've been using it for a long time.
Okay, well, I can't help you because I'm not psychic. I can't look through
what's happening.
Well,
Anybody else?
I think that's where you need to look at it. You might want to restore the factory settings. Got to let you go. Coming up on a commercial break. We'll be right back after these words from our sponsor. Hi, America. Welcome back to the last segment of our show today. Over at Jim Sinclair's Mindset, he's got a notification up, and I just linked it to whatreallyhappened.com. The headline is Today's Massive Attempt to Break Gold. Remember what I said earlier about all the stuff coming out saying, gold's not doing well, silver is just junk metal. You don't want to waste your money on these coins and bars and the rest of it. And so basically he's out there saying there does appear to be a massive attempt to suppress gold, to camouflage the weakening Western banking system. They're saying paid shills, he's calling them bashers, are flooding into all the pro-gold sites, and many other gold sites are under attack in other ways. Gold banks are flogging the paper market, seeking to keep the price down, but they're trying to not sell too much of the paper contracts because somewhere down the road they got to redeem them, and they're running out of physical here. So they're trying to keep gold under 1,600. They need people to keep their money in the stock market and in the banks. And they're getting really, really desperate. And a reminder, if you have any extra cash on hand, and you should be thinking seriously about taking a part of your savings account and bring it back home, and you want to go into silver and gold physical, do not go for paper. And a reminder, over at republicbroadcasting.org, you will see a link to the Republic Trading Group. And they are gold and silver dealers. And when you do business with them, you are helping to support Republic Broadcasting so that we can keep on getting this information out so that you can make good choices. As long as the bankers are working as hard as they can to keep the prices down, now is the time to buy in. Sooner or later, it will go up. And even if it doesn't, it's not going to go down the way the U.S. dollar is. And so, again, looking at what's going on at Cyprus, and it's already spreading to other countries. They're talking about a second, haircut. And Ben Bernanke's out there saying, I'm not worried about a haircut. I don't have any hair. But now's the time to really seriously think about taking, if you've got a savings account, and I know a lot of you don't, I certainly don't, but if you have a savings account, you want to think about bringing some of that money home and just keep it under your own control. Under the mattress, in the mayonnaise jar, buried out by the pineapple plant, wherever. And if you have significant cash on hand, seriously think about getting some physical silver and gold. Do not go into the paper contracts. That one article that we linked showed the paper contracts are doing very poorly, but they're being used to drag down the price of silver by blending the physical and paper contracts. It is very important. They can't keep this Ponzi scheme going much longer. They're desperate to start a world war to distract from it. If they don't get the world war, it is all going to come crashing down. And you've got to be taking care of you and your family, because the government isn't going to do it. The government's looking out for itself. The bankers are looking out for themselves. If you want to survive the coming crisis, you must take action now. And on that thought, the music is starting. We're going to be back here tomorrow on the Republic Broadcasting Network. Until then, stay safe, keep informed, make good choices, share what you know with who you know. Please support whatreallyhappened.com. Please support Republic Broadcasting, and just tell all your friends they got to tune in and find out what's going on. Aloha, America.